It's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and I thank everyone for the invitation. Anytime I get a chance to talk to people about what we're doing research-wise, and also the work that our students are engaged in with us, they're my research partners, so I couldn't do what I do without the students, and so I always try and emphasize to them that when we go out into the field in environments like what you're going to see here tonight, that they're more than just students. I'm using air quotes. I try and emphasize that they're emerging archaeological professionals, and what my job is to teach them how to conduct archaeology responsibly and ethically, and we get some pretty good results doing that, actually. So I'm excited to tell you about some of the stuff that I've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years. Well, so we're up to research on 4 different continents now, and that might surprise some. It may be not that impressive to others if you worked on 5, 6, 7 continents. But for me, this is you know, an account of what our research has produced since I've been there, at least, and they're very diverse research projects. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 projects that are archaeological in nature, and I'm going to talk to you about 1 project that's more applied anthropology. And by the time we're all done with this, I hope you'll get a sense of the technology that I use, how it allows us to do things we couldn't do without it, and also hopefully make the world a little bit better place while we're doing it. So. Okay, so I'll start out by saying that I teach courses on pretty much everything that you're going to see here. So whether it's going to the field and doing archaeology or the technology courses that you'll see. I have students studying with me, you know, every semester learning this kind of stuff. And we have opportunities for both students and non-degree seeking students who just want to do archaeology to go to the field with us as well. So I'm pretty happy to say that it doesn't matter if you're 18 or 80, and I'm not kidding. If you want to go to the field, we have opportunities for you. Okay. I'll start out by talking about the technology broadly, and it's a technology that we refer to as remote sensing. You might know it as aerial photography, satellite imagery, drone pictures, but you know, in terms of the science, we approach it from the body of theory, method, and techniques associated with remote sensing. I'll talk to you a little bit about the drone use that I engage in, and also some of the legal and ethical questions that go along with that. I'll also talk to you about, again, the 4 research projects that I've been, well, it's 4 now. I should have updated my slide. 3 distinct projects, but it's 4, so what do you want? I'll just go on. Okay. So what is remote sensing? You may recognize the aircraft at the top of the slide there. That's the SR-71, and its job, if you don't know what an aircraft like that does, it's not to bomb things or drop paratroopers out of the belly of the plane. It's meant to fly really fast and really high and spy on people. And also, the satellites are a technology that we use for remote sensing. When we talk about remote sensing, that's simply the science of obtaining information from areas or objects at a distance, and especially through satellite or aircraft. There are other ways to perform remote sensing, but in terms of, you know, how people understand it with aerial photography, it's usually done with aircraft or satellites. This gentleman here, you may not know when aerial photography started, but this is how this gentleman here, also known as Nadar, I'm not going to butcher his French surname because I don't speak French, which is really funny because I'm going to tell you about a research project I'm doing in France right now. So It's not without its pitfalls. Okay, so the history of remote sensing starts with Nadar. He's the first true aerial photographer, and what he did was take a camera, put it into a balloon, and in 1858 started shooting pictures. And unfortunately, we don't have any known copies of his work. So it would be nice as part of the historical record to have plates from his original flights, but no known copies exist. If you do know of copies, please flag me down after the talk, because I'd be interested in discussing that with you. So, you know, as early as 1858, people are putting cameras in airborne platforms and trying to do remote sensing, even though they may not have thought about it that way. All right, so fast forward a little bit in time. This is a picture of an army balloon, and balloons were used during the Civil War to observe battle movements and things like that. The gentleman who's a big proponent of this as a technology was a man named Thaddeus Lowe, and he was kind of he was famous in his own right, had some notoriety, and he decided he wanted to prove the concept. So in 1861, he gets in a balloon and floats, and this is a true story, folks, floats from Cincinnati to South Carolina by mistake. And during all of this, the Civil War breaks out, and he's actually captured by the Confederate Army as a spy. And because he is so noteworthy, they were able to do some negotiations with the Confederate officials, and they got him back, and he went back to doing it again. So I find that a fascinating chain of events. And he was later appointed by President Lincoln to the U.S. Army Balloon Corps. And so move forward a little bit more in time, and this is one of my favorite stories here. What we have are pictures of the Bavarian Pigeon Corps from 1903. And what they would do was they would strap these cameras to these pigeons' chests, and they were automatically triggered to cycle every 30 seconds and take pictures. It's not April yet, right? It's not April 1st. It's not April Fool's. This is true. This really happened. It's hard to believe. It's kind of washed out with the lights here, but you can tell that these are real. These are feathers on the edges of the screen. It worked. It actually worked. So, you know, I have no idea what the recovery rate was on the pigeons after they set them out, and how easy they were to take out of the sky if you were the enemy. But this is a proof of concept, and apparently it was actually successful. Okay. So again, move forward more in time. The advent of powered flight, heavier than air machines, become a usable technology, and we get the first pictures taken in 1909 from the heavier than air aircraft over France. And a lot of people don't know, but Wilbur Wright of the Wright brothers actually piloted that aircraft. I bring it up every time because I'm a native of Dayton, Ohio, which absolutely, positively is the birthplace of aviation. Don't let anybody from North Carolina tell you otherwise. The Wright brothers bicycle shop was in my hometown. And so they invented it in my hometown, but they took it down there to actually fly it. So again, anybody wants to argue with me, we could talk after the show. Then, you know, the technology is working so well at this point that during World War I, the U.S. collects over 1 million photographs during the last 4 months of the war, which is a huge amount of data. Now, it's nothing compared to what we collect today because of the cell phones in our pockets, but it's still quite impressive. And then remote sensing technology moves forward again during World War II, when we start to get the first video cameras that were actually used to varying degrees of success to steer remotely piloted aircraft. You know, it wasn't a terribly reliable technology, but you know, they were working on the very first generation of what will become unmanned aerial vehicles that I'm benefiting from today. Of course, the Cold War comes around after World War II ends. You may recognize this aircraft here. It's a U-2 spy plane. And this is when we really see the ante being raised in terms of remote sensing products, and how that can influence geopolitical events. And you may recall a little incident where Francis Gary Powers was shot down in 1960, and it was a huge crisis. And of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was fueled by aerial reconnaissance photos from pilots flying over the island, and that's how they detected the Soviet missiles in Cuba. So, you know, you go from a guy taking photos in a balloon to strapping cameras on a pigeon's chest to almost blowing up the world, you know, by 1962. So it's become a very powerful technology for all kinds of reasons, and I try and leverage it for scientific purposes. So what we have here are some photos taken from the Corona spy satellite program, and what would happen was they actually had these satellites that would fly around the world, and they would take photos, and then they would drop the canisters out, and that aircraft on the left is actually capturing a canister in midair. Yeah, it's not something I would want to do, but that was a real thing. And so they would get these Corona satellite photos flying over areas of interest like the Soviet Union, and they would get the photos, develop them, and the resolution on the photos that they would have would be about 5 feet by 5 feet. So what that means is, you know, when we talk about resolution in an image, that's the discernible amount of detail that you can get from an image. So to think about it usefully, I think, with these spy satellite photos, anything smaller than about 5 by 5, you couldn't really make out and discern it individually. It would have to be bigger than that. So keep that 5 foot by 5 foot resolution in your mind when I show you some of the stuff that I've got with my drone, and things have changed quite a bit. All right, so today, again, we moved from Francis Gary Powers and people flying over and getting shot down, you know, to these remotely piloted vehicles that you see on the screen right now. So that's U.S. Air Force, Global Hawk, reconnaissance drone, and also we have spy satellites that are capable of providing imagery on demand over a particular area that might be of interest, so you're not limited by when is the satellite going to go over the next time. You can actually send something where you want it, when you want it, and you can do that a variety of different ways, and we do have a much greater resolution available to us today than the 5 foot by 5 foot resolution that you saw with Corona. Now, you know, 25 centimeter resolution from a satellite isn't unheard of, so that's quite a big leap from the mid-20th century. All right, so let's move to archaeology. You know, so that's an overview of the technology and how it's used generally. Now we're going to think about how anthropologists and archaeologists use this technology. And what you'll see a lot of nowadays is the technology being used for digital terrain modeling. So when you think about, you know, the landscape and how it goes up and down, you get your valleys, you get your peaks, and the rolling terrain that you might have in your backyard. Well, it's very useful for us to be able to map that at a high precision scale. And so you'll get a lot of people using remote sensing, especially from drones, for terrain modeling. And then you also get topographic mapping. And so we can recreate these landscape environments in a digital environment for a variety of reasons. I actually use a lot of this data collect it. Oh, no, that was a mistake. I collect it, and then what I'm able to do is take these digital landscapes and do more computer experiments on them later. So often when I'll use the remotely sensed data from the real world to create virtual worlds where I can run social science computer experiments. And I'm doing that right now for a site in Israel that I'm going to talk about here in a minute. But first, let's talk about legal and ethical concerns for drones. So who in here has a drone or has flown a drone or has a family member who has drones? Okay, great. As you know, probably the government's becoming more and more interested in monitoring what people do with these things. And so if pretty much, regardless of the purpose for which you use a drone, if it's over a half a pound, you have to register it with the FAA. So there's little tiny drones that you might get in the toy aisle. Some of them you have to register, some of them you don't. But but the FAA requirements vary depending on if you're an amateur or a professional. I mentioned as well that if it's over a half a pound, you have to register it, and the whole point is that public safety is of crucial importance. So I'll be walking around Oakland University campus, and it happens every year at least, if not more. I'll see a student flying a drone on campus, and you know, because, well, let's face it, I'm a professor, and I get to run around campus and say, hey, I'm a professor, and I'm also a pilot. Part of what I'm doing is educating people. And there is no place without an FAA permit that you're actually allowed to fly drones on Oakland's campus. It's too close to Oakland, the Oakland airport. You're not, if you're within 5 miles of an airport, you're not supposed to be flying without clearance. All right. And so they have apps and things now for your cell phone that you can actually turn on your GPS, pull up the app, and see if you're in limited airspace. And so I'll have several of my colleagues around campus who are like doing environmental research or something like that and say, hey, can you come out and image this area, you know, out in Pontiac for me? Nope. No, I can't. Because if you look at the map, it's all restricted airspace. I mean, I can, but I have to get a permit for it. And it's a pretty cumbersome process. If you're an amateur, it's a different thing. You don't need to be licensed if you're flying for recreation. The airspace rules are the same, but if you make money flying drones for any reason, you have to be licensed, and so that's why I have a pilot's license from the FAA. I'm going to show you why that's important in this clip right here. So what I would like to do is have you watch the skier and watch behind him as he comes down the hill.
Vorsprung auf seinen Teamkollegen 1:08 Dritter muss werden, dann übernimmt wieder die Führung der
So that isn't just, you know, maybe I'll just leave this like that because it worked, and I'll come back to it. Okay. So part of the issue here, let me go back to, so what you saw there was was like one of those quadcopters that follows around the football players on the football field. Would you want to get hit with that thing? I wouldn't either. And so that's why we have regulations like don't fly over people. You know, don't fly above 400 feet because you don't want something with that kind of mass to come in contact with an aircraft. And so these are just, there are a lot of rules and regulations, and also there are privacy concerns as well. So where I live an hour and a half away, there's a city called DeWitt that has recently passed ordinances that say you are not allowed to fly these within our city limits. And it's because they're worried about privacy concerns. They're worried about, you know, who's going to fly this 4K video outside my bedroom window and film me, you know, in context I don't want to be filmed. So, you know, toys are great, the technology's great, but when, you know, everybody has to be responsible. And not only that, but when you start doing it professionally, the rules become a lot more restrictive. And the FAA is trying to improve the processes, but it's slow going. So I'll turn our attention to some field work that I've been doing. This is the first project I'm going to talk to you about. This is an archaeological research project we had going at Oakland for 4 years total. We've moved on to another site now, but the data that you're going to see is from the research that I conducted at Tel Lahish, Israel. So if you're looking at the arrow here, Gaza is here, Haifa is here, Jerusalem is here, Lahish is right here. I think one of the really cool aspects of Oakland University is our study abroad program that we have. And so if you're looking at these displays, which, by the way, tonight's the first time they've ever been seen in public, brand new, folks. These photos are all from our study abroad in Israel. And this is one of the sites that we were working on. If you are interested in joining us, again, you don't have to be a student. We do have continuing education facilitation, I guess it would be, if you want to come with us, and I can talk to you about that after the talk. But anyhow, what we're doing here is working at Tel Lahish, which is a site that's been occupied perhaps as early as 9,000 years ago. The archaeology, the dating and the data sets are less than certain about that, but it goes back probably 7,000 to 9,000 years. And the site's important because it's the second most important city in what was Judah at the time, second only to Jerusalem. And we were there to focus on the destruction of the city in 701 BC by the Assyrians. So if you don't know the story, there was an Assyrian king named Sennacherib who essentially went all through the region, toppling cities and looting and enslaving people. And that's what he was doing here in 701 BC. He was at Lahish. This, if you're a biblical scholar or you're interested in biblical history, the site is mentioned several places in both the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. And tonight we're going to be focusing on the southern part of what you're looking at in that image right now, which is actually the siege ramp that was built by the Assyrians to conquer the city. So we have to get our heads around what kind of research has been done at this site before we can make a contribution. And it turns out that there were 3 expeditions to the site prior to us. And one was in the 1930s by the head archaeologist at the time was a gentleman named James Starkey and his research associate Olga Tufnell, and he worked on that site from 1932 to 1938. Then fast forward a little bit in time, in the 60s, a gentleman by the name of Aharoni from Tel Aviv University worked there. And again, in the 70s and 80s, David Ushishkin from Tel Aviv University decided to do some work different areas of the site, and then we come along in the, well, I guess that would have been 2014. We started working there. And, 2013, okay. And so there was a central research question I was interested in, which was that when you have that many people working over the site for that long, and you're trying to understand what's been dug up and what hasn't been dug up. It's pretty hard to do. And the reason is because the way that the land is surveyed changes over time. The technology that people use to survey the land changes over time. And all of this matters because as archaeologists, what we have to do is find archaeological materials that haven't been disturbed. That's the only way that we can help make sense out of what happened at a site. So if you're in some other guy's backfill pile that was working there in the 1930s, it's not going to tell you the story that you want. And so that was my immediately upon showing up at the site, I was like, yeah, this is a big site and it could be a mess. And we don't really have a good idea as to who was working where and when. And we fixate on millimeters, okay? So like to be off a foot because somebody made a bad map, that's a big deal for us. All right. I saw immediately an opportunity to use some of the drone-based technology at this site to make a contribution to the expedition and also not waste our time. What you have here is the first ever aerial flight of Oakland's EB drone. This is, as you can see, fixed-wing aircraft, so it flies like an airplane. It does not fly like a helicopter like a lot of people have seen in the past. And that's important because an aerial platform like this is really good at collecting a lot of data over a large area very quickly. A helicopter, it can hover, it can focus on a particular area, and I can't do that, but it also can't do, a lot of them can't cover the same area I can cover. And if you're working really large sites, that's important. It's about 1.5 pounds, believe it or not. It's made out of styrofoam and plastic, and so if you have a bike helmet at home that keeps you from cracking your skull when you have a bike accident, it's made out of the same stuff. So it's very durable, it's very light. It can fly up to 56 miles an hour, so stay in the air for about 45 minutes, go up to about 3,000 feet, assuming you're in a place where you can fly 3,000 feet, which we can't here. So I did fly higher than I would here in Africa, and I'll tell you about that later. And it can stay up in winds up to about 28 miles an hour. Stay in communication with its radio link up to about 1.86 miles. And it has different kinds of cameras that I can put in this thing, and that's very important. So what it has is regular normal cameras like you would have on your phone. That's what we call RGB, red, green, blue, or visual band camera technology. I also have a near-infrared camera that I can put in the aircraft, which is good at detecting light in the near-infrared range. That's light that you can't see with your normal eye. And then I also have a sensor called a multispectral camera. And what that is a camera that has 5 different sensors in it. One of the sensors can see regular visual band light, and then it's got 4 other sensors and wavelengths that our eyes cannot see. And I'll explain how that's useful here in a minute. So I've got a lot of flexibility in terms of the sensor package that I can put in this aircraft, and it flies itself. It actually flies itself. I pre-program it. I launch it into the air. I fly it via computer, and it lands itself too. So I don't have to worry about human error, which is really nice. It's got a built-in GPS, so it knows where it is on the planet, and and it can also talk to other drones too. If you have other people flying in the area, you can avoid mid-air collisions, which are always a good idea to avoid. All right. I'm going to show you that because I have some figures here. So this image that you're seeing here was collected by the EB from its first ever flight. And what this is showing is high precision aerial photography gathered from about 200 feet in the air. And in terms of area, it's about 140 acres that I imaged in about 40 minutes. Why that's significant is that I'm going to show you a 3D model of this site, and one of the things you're going to notice is it's really tall, but then you're also going to notice that it's really rugged. There's a lot of up and down to this site. There are a lot of unfilled excavation pits on this site that if you fall in, we may not find you. I've spent weeks of my life walking over this tell, which is a tell is a mound or a hill, a human-made mound or hill. I've spent weeks of my life walking over this tell with a GPS, trying to sample points on the landscape for elevation. That's how we make really accurate topographic maps. And I've almost fallen off the side of this thing. It's not fun. There are, snakes and scorpions and all that fun stuff too. So if I have the option of spending weeks of my life poorly sampling a tell to create a substandard map, or I can throw up my drone, fly it for 40 minutes, and get 140 acres worth of area imaged. And by the way, the resolution on this, 2 to 3 centimeters. 2 to 3 centimeters, depending on what sensor I'm using. So I choose not to fall in a hole and die, is what I choose. Okay. So what you see here, this particular image was pieced together through 340 visual band images or so. I also took another map I put together another map with near-infrared images, and I also use what are called GPS control points. So that's what those little dots are that you see on the screen here, is that for every one of these dots, I have a really high precision grade GPS that I've sampled the point of the Earth right on that spot. The reason I have to do that is because the GPS in the drone itself has about the same accuracy as what you have here in your cell phone right now. And does anybody know about how accurate these are? Any idea? Don't get me wrong, they're great, because I found this place with this today. So it's good enough to get me here. So on any given day, it all depends on how many satellites you have access to, what kind of atmospheric interferences, messing with the signal. But essentially, on a map with grid coordinates, there's a coordinate to this spot right here, and we know what the number is, right? This is going to get you within 3 to 5 meters, one way or another, of so 9 to 15 feet, okay? 9 to 15 feet in terms of accuracy for your GPS and your phone, and that's the same accuracy that the drone has with its built-in GPS. And as I mentioned before, for archaeologists, 9 to 15 feet that's a lot of error. That's not good enough for us. So what I can do is I can bring with me a much more accurate GPS that you might see on like a construction site. So you see people walking around with a big disc on a pole and like a thing. I'll show you a picture here when I'm in France. I'm using one. That has accuracy of about 1 centimeter horizontal data, and or horizontal, and 1.5 centimeters vertically. So I can take that error out of these images by snapping it to these sample points, and we could go that direction. I should mention, it may surprise you, I have a lot of interaction with the archaeological community here in the state and the region. To my knowledge, there's not another program that I know of in the state that has this capability. A lot of people don't realize how sophisticated Oakland University is in terms of our research capabilities. And, you know, I mean, there are other people using drones for different reasons around the state, but there's no one who's using it like we're using it here. And I'm very proud of that. So, in addition to the map that you just saw that keeps me very happy by not falling down holes and creating great topographic maps, I can also produce products like what you see here. This is a normalized difference vegetation index called an NDVI. And what you're looking at is essentially moisture content of the plants on the ground. And what we can do with this is, depending on the time of year that you fly over the site, you can actually sometimes detect subsurface features, archaeological features below the ground, that if you were walking over top of them, you wouldn't even see. And so in this image here, what you're seeing is if it's red, it's got less moisture. If it's yellow, it's got a little bit more moisture. As you move to green, it's got more moisture. And so it's the idea that soil, depending on whether or not it's been disturbed, will hold different moisture contents that will affect the vegetation on the ground, and then you will actually be able to see those patterns, you know, from the air using these different cameras. And so we're able to do that, and I've got a really nice example from France that will illustrate that quite well. So I use specialized software called Pix4D to process different images and stitch all of these different photos together, and I can then create topographic models, relating to the relief on the surface of the landscape, and also we can create what's called orthomosaics, which are these photographs that you're seeing that actually have both the curvature of the earth taken out of it and the curvature of the lens taken out of it, so you can actually measure from here to here in a known distance without having those variables create error in your measurements. This particular map that you're looking at right now has about 3.18 centimeter resolution, no, 3.10 resolution, which is a lot better than 5 feet by 5 feet. Okay. And again, I can simultaneously, as I'm stitching all this stuff together, I can create these contour maps. And so if you've ever been in the Scouts, you might have seen a contour map. If you have the old Michigan Gazetteers that you used to be able to buy in like the gas stations and stuff, that I don't know if they still sell them or not, but what we're looking at here are the contour lines, and each one of these lines has an elevation associated with it. The closer the lines are, the steeper the change in elevation from one line to the other. So these lines here, this is the top of the tell. It's much flatter, so these lines are not as close together. These are the steep sides of the tell, and you can really get a sense of, when I talked about almost falling off this thing, it's about 100 feet high from here to about here. You don't want to fall. If I wanted to do this, like I said, I would have taken weeks, sampled points imperfectly, and not had anywhere near as accurate a map as what I have here. So we have unparalleled survey efficiency, and I can do this on any site I want to work on as long as it's not restricted airspace. And then what it allows me to do, again, take these images, put them together in a 3D model, and create what we call 3D visualization. And so what I'm about to show you is the first 3D model of the site ever produced at this accuracy and scale. And I'm hoping this will work. The YouTube thing didn't work, but maybe this will work. We'll see here in a second. But what you're looking at, it looks like a photograph, yeah? Okay. What you're seeing is actually much more like a video game than it is a photograph. This is actually a 3D model where a digital point cloud has been created to add three-dimensional depth to it. And so while it looks like a photograph, it's much closer to a video game. And if it all works right, we'll go on a virtual tour of Lahish. There we go. Okay, so here we are coming into the city. This is the southern part. The Assyrians would have been over here. Now we're going to fly over this gate. This is a reconstruction, but this would have been where the original gate was to the city. Now we're flying over what would have been the palace or the administration building here. And you could start to see the relief of the tell and the surrounding landscape. These are actually overhead tents. People are doing archaeology below them to keep them from getting baked by the sun. For scale, that's a pickup truck over there. So it gives you an idea of how big this site actually is. Now we're looking down from the north toward the south, where this is actually the counter ramp built by the residents of the city to fight the Assyrians as they're trying to invade the town. I take my students up here when we go to the site and have them stand at the top of the siege ramp and explain to them in 701 BC, you would have looked down across that ravine and seen the entire Syrian army waiting to destroy everybody you know and take everything you have. And what it does is it gives them a whole new sense of meaning to the site. This isn't, you know, this was not a game. This was annihilation. By the way, that 3D point cloud, for every pixel you see on that screen, I've got a precise GPS coordinate accurate to about 1 to 1.5 centimeters. Okay. So the question was, you know, again, coming back to the mapping of who had worked there before and what it means for us, I decided that there's a really good way to assess what we call error and uncertainty with the surveying that had been done from the 1930s up until when we got there. And it's using the drone imagery as a base map, essentially, to tie everybody else's maps to, because there are known fixed points on a landscape that appear on all those maps. And what I can do is use my drone data, tie their maps to my drone data where I have a known amount of error in my data, and then quantitatively figure out how off those maps are, depending on if it was Starkey or Ushishkin or Aharoni or us. And again, that's a pretty big deal if you're trying to avoid digging up somebody else's trench that got dug up in the 30s, okay? And so that's what I'm working on right now for that excavation there. Now I'm going to take the same technology and tell you about a project I'm working on in France using the same sensors, but for different reasons. And it'll give you a sense of how adaptive, I think, these tools can be. I'm going to tell you about a project that I'm working on in France called the CHATEAU de BALLEROY Landscape Project that is in Normandy, France. So just to point out a little bit of issue and scale here. We're out here and about 15 miles away from the D-Day landings or so. And it's by car ride, it's probably on a good day, probably 3 hours away from Paris. Okay. Just to give you a sense of where we are. And it is a very rural environment, absolutely. And not unlike Michigan, except more fun, because it's France. So, you know, okay. So this is the town of BALLEROY, and what you're looking at here, this is the chateau itself, BALLEROY Castle. This is the town of BALLEROY outside of the chateau. This is the main approach coming in to the town. So if you're coming from Paris, you go through Caen, then you go through Bayeux, then you go to BALLEROY, and you will come into the town through this wonderful planned approach that you see here. It's beautiful just from the Google Earth image that you see here. And so this was a planned community. This place didn't exist until the early 17th century. And it actually, the chateau was built, and then the town came later. And there's always been kind of an interesting relationship between the chateau and the townsfolk that I'll talk about here in a second. But if you go there today, this is the chateau. And it's a really cool structure. This is actually a waterless moat, so it never had actually water in it. But if you came up through the town, you would approach the building from the town from this aspect, and then these are actually, this is kind of a cool visual trick from the architect. Those are actually freestanding buildings. They're not part of the chateau, but he built it so that the house actually looks bigger than it actually is. And so these are faux guard shacks that if you had guards, sentries standing out of the chateau, they could kind of hang out in there and not get caught in the rain and stuff like that. What's so interesting about the architectural features that I just described is that this was built after any of that was needed. They didn't need a moat. They didn't need guard shacks. This is kind of, it's ironic. It's an, it's an ironic nod to majesty, to grandeur. And there's a good reason for that. Because this chateau was built by a gentleman named Francois Mansart. If you've heard of Francois Mansart, then you will know him as one of the founders of, who really solidified the French interpretation of classicism in Baroque architecture. And what that means is that he was really into these big, bold designs that architecturally emphasize power and spectacle and grandeur, right? And that's, I think that's what the ironic nod to the guard towers and the moats really is. And he is actually the great uncle of Jules Mansart, who was the architect at Versailles. Yeah. So, and this is going to come up here again in a second, because what you're seeing is, we were looking at, had a much tighter kind of shot of the chateau earlier. Now if you pull back this way, there are these gardens that sit out in front of the chateau that you would see as you come through the property gates. And these designs are inspired by a gentleman named André Le Nôtre, who was the gardener at Versailles and ran around with Mansart's great nephew. Okay, so Le Nôtre, he was kind of a rock star gardener. You could buy his designs and take them with you to, back to your chateau and have a little bit of Le Nôtre in your backyard if you really wanted to. He was very popular, and if you've ever been to Versailles, then you understand why. He's also had a really well-known role in laying out approaches in Paris that are still there to this day. This Mansart riddle between Francois and the younger Mansart and Le Nôtre becomes interesting because for the first couple of years I was going here, people kept saying, yeah, these gardens are by Le Nôtre, these gardens are by Le Nôtre. And I was like, I started to do research, and I'm thinking, I can't find anything in the literature that says that Le Nôtre actually worked at BALLEROY. He hung around Mansart's, great nephew, and he did work a little bit with Francois Mansart as a young man. So it's no question that he must have been influenced by what was going on in Balleroy, but there's nothing that ever suggests that he did the gardening here. And that's an important issue because my research focuses on the French formal gardens that are on this property. You may have heard of the mansard roof. This is an example. They're all over Paris. And so the mansard roof is obviously a modification of the spelling of Mansart. Mansart did not invent this roof, but he did popularize it. And it's characterized by kind of this two-tiered roof. You know, the bottom half's more steep than the second half. That's what's known as a mansard roof. And Francois popularized that design in France. Chateau Balleroy is the earliest surviving property by Francois Mansart in all of France. So if you're wanting to get an idea of his career progression, you start at Balleroy. Okay. One of the other interesting aspects of this property on the inside of the chateau is the staircase. This is a suspended staircase. I'm looking down from the top down to the front entrance. That you would come in, coming from the town into the chateau, and you see this beautiful this staircase with this banister, and this is actually suspended from the wall, so the weight is borne through the wall. There are no columns that actually keep the wall or keep the staircase in place. This was really an innovation at this point in time, and so that's just one reason why this property is so interesting. And also, on this banister, as you go from the ground floor all the way up to the very top, there are all kinds of inscriptions, graffiti carved into the banister. I'm also looking at that as well. Okay. This is the, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Back to the picture of the castle, the chateau, the one there.
Mm-hmm.
See that right side of the main building?
Uh-huh.
Seem like the roof is sagging.
Well, it is, actually, and the chateau needs about a $5 million roof job. Yeah. Yeah. So there is not, at this point, a straight wall in this place. And, you know, so the chateau is built in about 1626 is when they started, and they completed in 1636. And it's old. It needs some love, you know, and love for this building is expensive, you know. I don't know what they were originally for, but they were in the later years in the 19th century. There's a French painter who's part of the Balleroy family named Albert de Balleroy, and he hung around with Delacroix, Whistler, people like that. His studio was actually here, and if you walk in to that studio, it was like a time capsule. You would just see paintings on the wall. He was a sculptor too, so there were all these kind of weird disembodied feet and arms and stuff that they just left. And so nowadays there's a lot of storage that the chateau just shoves stuff in there. But the Albert Tower is what we call it. That was, as far as I know, where he worked and where he left his stuff. So this chateau is owned by the Forbes family of, Forbes magazine, Forbes Publishing. And Malcolm Forbes bought the property in 1972, partially because he served in Balleroy during World War II, not long after the invasion, and fell in love with the property. So when he came to his fortune, he was very keen at buying properties all over the world that needed rehab and redoing them, and that's what happened here. And it's been in the family since '72. It is also now the site of an international balloon museum, which, coming back to our first part of our discussion, when I said if you know where any Nadar photos are, let me know, because I can let the museum know. So this is all intertwined. It's not by accident. Okay. So if you're talking about full-time residency, no, but it's used as a vacation home for the family. Yeah. I'm there about twice a year. So people come in and out. It's very much, it has a chateau manager, and sometimes it's used for meetings, like Christopher Forbes is the on the board of the Louvre, and so they'll have like board meetings and stuff there. It's kind of an all-purpose meeting place at this point, but it also, they do give tours. So this is a French National Historic Property, and they have a very serious responsibility to the people of France to let people come and enjoy the property. You know, through most of the year, they close down in the winter, but then they open it up, and they let people walk the grounds and have like picnics on the grounds and things like that. It's really nice. Okay, so these are the original plans that hang in the main entrance, and I want you to just kind of keep in mind this geometry that you see here with this garden. This is the chateau here. This would have been that front entrance where you see Albert's studio and stuff coming up from the town. This is what would have been out back when it was originally built. I don't have a date for these plans, but you know, they are quite early in the chateau's history. I don't know if they're the original plans, but I don't know if it's a chicken or egg thing. The chateau came first and they did that, or they did that and then the chateau. I'm not sure, but it's very early. This is the original family that built the chateau, the Choisys. They, again, built the chateau, and then it transferred over to another family later. The BALLEROY family that you're seeing here lived at the chateau during the French Revolution. So this is the family that ended up with the property after the Choisys. And I was eating dinner in the main dining room one night, and I was looking at these gentlemen and became curious as to who they were. And then I started looking at the paintings even closer, and I noticed these black scarves around their neck. Does anybody know what that indicates? Guillotined during the Reign of Terror. And it just really made me sad. It made me sad because this place brings me such joy when I'm there. My wife and I, it's one of our favorite places in the world. And so to think about the Balleroys and what the political environment must have been like during the French Revolution, and knowing that there were at least two of the family that were beheaded as a result, it made me wonder why. And not only why, but, you know, what happened to the chateau after that? So was it abandoned? Was it ransacked? What was the political environment like? And so, come to find out that these two gentlemen, one is Charles, the third Marquis de Balleroy, and his brother Francois, and on October 10th of 1793, the Balleroy Revolutionary Committee comes and knocks on the door and says, "You're under house arrest." Not only that, but you'll see a picture here in a second of an old rendering of the property. There's a church right at the entrance coming up from the town. And so during the Reign of Terror, what they did was come into the church, trash everything they possibly could, defile the altar, defile the effigy of Christ in grotesque ways, and then march right up and tell the Marquis, "You're under arrest, house arrest." 2 days later, they ship him off to, he and his brother, to Bayeux, and they're in jail there for a while until ultimately they are executed in Paris on March 23rd, 1794. If you listen to the author of the local history written in 1860, he has nothing kind to say about the Balleroy Revolutionary Committee. He said, again, I understand that perspectives are relative, so you always have to question the author's motives, but the Balleroys by all accounts, especially by this gentleman, were pretty decent folks. They weren't, they were charitable in all the right ways, dealt with people in the community all the right ways, but the Revolutionary Committee had other thoughts. And so, again, that made me sad. This is a picture from 1715 that really shows, this is that church that I mentioned right here, which is much closer than it looks on this painting. It's just a couple of 100 yards away from the front door, really, maybe 300. So this is where the parterres are now. These are the outbuildings that would have been the stable coming up from the town. This is the moat, the main entrance, and then look back here, and you can see the formal French gardens. Again, much different than that first plan that I showed you. So this is an embellishment from 1715, and I'd like you to take note of these features here, the fountain here, and I said, you know, I'm interested in if any of the pre-revolutionary garden remains under the surface of the lawn out back. Because I did not know how the property was taken care of, you know, I just thought to myself, you know, what the revolution happens, the Balleroys are killed, a garden's not the cheapest thing to maintain, especially the one like you just saw. So did people come and trash the garden? You know, this is an important place on the landscape. Did they just let it go? Archaeologically, what remains underneath, if anything? These were questions I was interested in finding. So again, I threw the EB into the air. For the purposes of understanding at a broader scale, I wanted to image the chateau and the surrounding landscape and understand what subsurface archaeological features, if any, remained of the pre-revolutionary gardens. This is important. Again, as an archaeologist, you always have to be mindful. When we do archaeology, we destroy the resource that we're interested in studying. So you have to ethically have a very good reason for putting shovels in the ground to destroy an archaeological site. That's why pot hunting and like privy digging on historic farmsteads, that's why it's such a problem, is because once you do that, if you don't understand how to do it and how to preserve the information, it's gone forever. So one way I could answer my question without destroying an archaeological resource is put my drone in the air. That's what we call non-destructive archaeological prospection. And I thought it'd be good to have a high-resolution map too, so why not? This is the backyard where that garden would have been from the second floor. So that beautiful fountain, all of those, the manicured hedgerows, the paths, that's what it looks like today. And in the past, actually, this was more like a festival ground. The Balloon Museum would have an international balloon fest that was launched from here. People from all kinds of famous people would show up. I've got pictures of like Mick Jagger on the back lawn, Walter Cronkite. I mean, the list is long and distinguished, believe me. And so, again, they held a lot of large events. That could have messed stuff up. They had a French Revolution. That could have messed stuff up. By the way, in the 1940s, the chateau was a Nazi field hospital. And yes, and the only reason it wasn't destroyed, it had two big red crosses on the top of the outbuildings that are now the Balloon Museum and the administrative offices. And that's probably why it still stands. That's why it's probably why it's Mansar's earliest work, surviving work. So if you go there, you're not going to see much. I've walked across this field many times. You really can't get a sense that there was some kind of French formal garden there before. As a matter of fact, if you get on to Google Earth, this is what you'll see of the backyard. And mostly the only thing you can see in terms of patterning are the mower marks. Okay? So, threw my drone into the air, created that same kind of vegetation index that I created earlier in Israel. And I could start to, with the very first index that I created, see some of these patterns. And you could start to, there's some, I could tell that there's probably something going on around here. There's a straight line cutting right across there, so I decided to tweak the visual wavelength algorithm that I used to produce this. In addition to that, I took a digitized version of the CHATEAU plans and placed them over this index, right? So again, keep in mind, I scaled the picture to the building, not the lawn. Okay, I used what's called a geographic information system. It's a very precise computer program that works a lot like your navigation works on your phone. And I could see where the original layout, if the plans were to scale, and I have to believe that they were, what could I start to see in terms of subsurface patterning from the original garden? I wasn't even worried about the 1715 version. And I started to go, and I started to tweak wavelengths and started to see patterns until finally I got to, and now we could start to see, you see that? This lines up exactly perfectly with the curvature from the original plans. You see that right there? That's where the fountain was. You see these, this is a linear strolling path, and then up here, which, you know, they gave me a laser pointer, I think. I might be able to use that. I don't know. Yeah, okay. These are those box features that you saw on the 1715 version. The garden's still there, folks. The garden's still there. So that I have the answer to my question. Come to find out, the Balleroys are executed. The surviving male heir goes into exile. Is gone until about 1800. His sister, who's married to another aristocrat, takes care of the property while he's gone. So that it wasn't abandoned, it wasn't ransacked. She managed the property until he came back, and then, for whatever reason, turned it all back over to him. That's a pretty nice sister, right? Pretty nice sister. Okay. I get a call on, and I know, what do we have until about 8:30? I'll speed it up here. I get a call from the CHATEAU manager about another feature on the landscape that led me to a second research question, which is how do people mark, I understand how people use space on a landscape. I wanted to understand how people mark place. And so I get a call from the CHATEAU manager one day and says, Jon, I've been out to the back of the property and I found something you have to see. You must bring your special camera. And I said, okay, I can do that. So I show up, and it turns out that this is a rock quarry about a mile away to the southeast from the main chateau. It's not on any normal path. And as a matter of fact, this is the wooded path that you can drive a vehicle down, but not very well. And that's that fancy GPS that I told you about that I'm setting up there. So this is a place on a landscape that you wouldn't stumble upon. You have to know where it is. And it wasn't meant for everyone to know, I can tell you that. But there are these, there's a lot of graffiti from over the years, a large collection of graffiti over time. Much of it doesn't have a date. Some of it does, but you can't see it very well here. But these are very finely crafted, chiseled letters, like with artistic levels of precision, carved into this rock face in the middle of nowhere on the property. And the chateau manager couldn't tell what they said, didn't know why it was there, didn't know when it was put there, but hoped that I would be able to help him with that. Well, it turns out I could, because after this was covered with a lot of moss and a lot of debris and dirt. My wife and I went out there with, first thing we did, researched what is the National Historic Preservation Standard for cleaning rock art and also like historic gravestones and things like that, so we wouldn't damage what's there, either intentionally or unintentionally. And I was able to clean up what I could, but it still wasn't, you couldn't tell really, I mean, some of the graffiti you could see better than others. The chisel letters you can see very well, but I was interested in more than just that. I wanted to know, you know, who else might have been there and visited the spot. Well, I could tell it was French, but that was it. And so I brought my special camera and took a bunch of near-infrared photos using that, you know, picking up the wavelengths that you can't see with the naked eye, and it does help bring out some of that very hard-to-see rock art that's just kind of barely there still, and you might not be able to see it. You could always see the chiseled stuff, but the other stuff, like, you know, the Kilroy was here kind of graffiti that nobody ever meant for it to stay there forever. It's still there, and the camera helps pull that out. And you can, this is a near-infrared photograph where you can see the chiseled letters a little better now relative to the visual band. And the mystery was solved after I went through my all my data and pieced together the different photographs. It's Voltaire. It's Voltaire. And the English now, first of all, again, I don't speak French. I use Google Translate, so blame Google, okay? But the inscription in English via Google Translate, you'll get the spirit of it. It says, let us hide, let's move on with the wise, the serene evening of a day mingled with storms, and steal from the eye of the envious the little time left to me by the gods. Tender friendship, gift of heaven, pure beauty, wear a sweet day in my dark retreat. May I live and die in your arms, far from the bad guy who does not know you. And then it just stops. My interpretation is this is a place on the landscape for intimacy. This is not meant for everyone to know about. This is a place where people would go and spend intimate time. You don't create that kind of investment in marking place unless it's meaningful. And so while I can't say who did it or when they did it, based on its secluded location and very intimate surroundings, it's a pretty special place. In addition to that, this is a picture of just one of the selections of graffiti on the banister. And so what I did, and we don't have time for me to go through the 3D modeling of the banister, but essentially what I've done is I've created a 3D model of all the inscriptions on the banisters for all 9 sections, and this says "Heart of Courage" in French, and there are inscriptions all up and down that thing. And then I have a written archive where, from the beginning of the property until now, where I can cross-reference these names and start to speak of who these individuals were when they were living inside the chateau, and try and learn a little bit more about the residents over time. So I've got same technology, different scales for different purposes, but I'm really starting to understand heart and courage. That's what it is. I'm really starting to understand the different meaningful spaces and places of the property. All right. Now I'm going to show you just really fast using that same technology. This is an archaeological in nature. This is a project that I'm working on with researchers from Michigan State and also Kansas State. This is a project I'm working on in Malawi, in this region here, Lwande, the Lwande region of Malawi. And this is a grant that we have that is all about helping farmers in this region who live or die based on whether or not their corn crops survive. We are working with the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is the U.S. foreign aid arm, and also other partner universities on the ground to use my drone technology to assess crop health for farmers at a very household scale. And that's important because, well, I'll show you here in a second. That's important because because, again, if people, they're right on the bubble. If they have a crop that's only partially comes in, what they'll probably do is instead of eat it, they'll try and go sell it. And in order to take a chance and parlay money into some more money that will last them the rest of the year. And it's a pretty chancy thing. So again, what we're doing is using that same technology that I used to detect French Revolutionary gardens and apply it to sustainable agriculture in other parts of the world. And the technology works, folks. What we've done is we've taken the chlorophyll measurements that we could sense from the drone in the air and compare them with measurements on the ground that we took by hand. And the question was, how accurate is this technology actually? And can it be helpful? Because nobody really knew. And the answer is yes, it's quite helpful. And then the last project, this is me working in the Mimbres Valley in New Mexico. If you've ever been in this area, this is the Gila National Forest area. And I was teaming with University of Nevada, Las Vegas. They were working on what we call a salvage archaeology project, basically. They had a 1,000-year-old archaeological site that was washing out of an arroyo, and human bodies were falling out of the outwash. And so the Native American communities asked us to come in and responsibly do the research, excavate the area, because their ancestors were, their graves were being destroyed. And so University of Nevada, Las Vegas, it was their project, but I was partnered with one of my associates there that I worked in Israel with. And he said, hey, you want to come out and do some archaeological survey with the drone? And so I did. This is the site of Elk Ridge, just inside the Gila National Forest in New Mexico. And this is the site. This is the arroyo here. And this is a 1,000-year-old Pueblo house that's getting washed out. This is as they dug down through the different layers, you can see the foundation of the house right there. And so they are very rigid rectangular structures. You can get a sense of their design just from this photo. And what the Mimbres Mogollon, that's the name of the people who lived there 1,000 years ago, would do was they would actually bury their dead in the floor of the house. And so they would bury the dead and often cover their head with a ceramic pot, and then cover them back up. And they would live with their ancestors in their houses. And as that arroyo crept closer to the foundation, that's when the human remains started to pop out. And so this was very much, a collaboration between the National Forest Service, the local Native American communities, and University of Nevada, Las Vegas to work in tandem to do the right thing in terms of archaeological stewardship. And I really appreciate the work. And so this was an area that we imaged that's right near that structure that you just saw. And these dots are GPS marks where they had come through and brought a ground-penetrating radar and picked up some anomalies of where there might be disturbed soils in the ground. And so the next step was, okay, we've got these ground-penetrating radar signatures. We're going to take people and send them out there to dig stuff up. And it turned out not one of those anomalies had anything in it. And I thought, maybe there's a different way to do this. And so using the different moisture indices that I have, I produced this. And what I found was, no, I'm not picking up much either where these anomaly signatures are here. But you know what? If I were going, I'd put a shovel here in this box right here. I'd put a shovel probably down here. See, so it's an alternate method to think about when you get those regular patterns of rectangles and lines that tend not to occur in nature. They had one remote sensing technology in there, and it didn't work. So I've given them an idea of where they can go. That was last field season, so if they go back, they have an idea now of where they might be able to find some other house structures, because this is actually right on the edge of the Forest Service land. As people, there were private citizens, they were like cutting down the fences, driving across the boundary and driving right over these archaeological resources with four-wheelers and stuff like that. And so you do get both, support and resistance from local people sometimes with the work that we do. As a matter of fact, I think, and keep in mind, I've flown my drone in Israel for 2 or 3 years. I think this was the first time my drone was ever shot at. Yeah. So I think that those people are actually trying to knock my drone out of the air. They didn't. So this is just an example of using this technology as an additional sensor to give them an idea of where they can use their resources, in future excavations. And so that's kind of the 4 different research projects, 4 different continents, same technology, all very different questions. And there are plenty more questions to be asked. So I believe it's 8:30. On that note.